Hey everyone, welcome to History Shop Talk. My name is Rob, and today I'm going to be doing a book review on a book called Death Traps, written by Belton Cooper, published I think in 1998. So for those of you who haven't read it yet, got a photo there on the left and on the back side. This is the narrative that the Library Journal puts out, and I'm going to talk to you about this book because it offers a perspective not often seen. It's really focused from the maintenance officer's point of view and the folks that come onto the battlefield immediately following a battle. And it also is, for whatever reason, one of these books that seems to have drawn a lot of heat for for his opinions. Okay. So who are we to believe? The Library Journal here who writes nice things about him, or the pundits, right? So let's take a quick look. For those of you who don't have time, I'm going to recommend the book to you. The main reason is it provides a different perspective. Everyone's familiar with the dashing fighter pilot, the daring tank commander, the courageous infantryman, and let's face it. How do you write a book that makes maintenance interesting? Okay. Cooper actually does a tolerably good job. So in today's agenda, we're going to look at, what's the book about, what the critics say, what did he actually write, where are there legitimate grievances against him, so to speak, and then we'll talk about some of the evidence that supports his assertions about the M4, which is sort of the crux of most of those attacks, and then why should you read it? But again, bottom line, I think you will find this to be a good book, worth your time and your money. Okay, what is it? It's a first-person testimonial from a maintenance officer's point of view. He's actually an ordnance officer in 3rd Armored Division in the European Theater of Operations. It provides a narrative of the entire theater from basically early July. He goes in I think 20 days after D-Day through the end of the war. It talks about the maintenance, the support perspective, the weaponry as an ordnance officer through the campaign. And along the way, he injects his personal vignettes, his personal experiences, and sort of tells you how it felt to be in those different places, on those different battlefields. And unlike what some of his critics suggest, he doesn't make himself out to be the hero in the fight. If you read the book objectively, he's pretty respectful of the people who are fighting these battles and what they're going through, and the work that all of these maintenance people are doing to keep these tanks in the fight. I think you'll find it's pretty humble reading. But one of the things that I like about the book is it does address some of the technical aspects of the M4 from that maintenance point of view. The problem is when he injects his personal judgments and assessments, people try and shred him, and we're gonna look at that and see how valid that is. Now, the first place that I noticed people sharpshooting was the Chieftain's video on tank myths, and this is a photo that he was projecting up on the screen when he was giving his briefing, and Cooper's book is wrong. Now, Nicholas Moran is one of those people that what I call a reputable source. When you watch his videos, you'll understand what I mean. He's very thorough, very detailed. He starts off saying, Death Traps is a great book. I highly recommend it. But then he kind of poo-poos it from that point on. He says, his slide says Cooper is wrong. He suggests that, Cooper makes the claim that if the right decisions had been made, the Pershing tank could have been available on D-Day. And these discussion, or this narrative, is all related to a myth that he was discussing about the Pershing tank. He claims that General Patton did not like them, that Cooper is accusing General Patton of not liking the Pershing, which is why it got pushed back. He kind of downplays it as a memoir. Well, as if that's not a historical work. And then he talks about, that where did Cooper get the idea that Patton was involved in tank development? Nobody knows. Suffice it to say, it's not true. So, in the discussion of this Pershing myth, he says, "Hey, there's this good book. I highly recommend it." But then he poo-poos it the rest of the time that he talks about it. So let's kind of take a look at what happens when somebody reputable throws this out. What you start to get are these sort of second tier of the onion kind of thing. People who start to throw in their opinions, and they reference the chieftain a lot, and they pick and choose their arguments. So here's an example. We're going to look at this a little more closely, but I've highlighted a couple of the comments. This tidbit is disgustingly stupid. He's talking about this comment here, and we'll come back to that. I think it's more funny than it is stupid, but we'll come back to it. And then he goes on and he starts throwing around, ratios, the M4 versus the Panther, and, which tank was better, basically. And this is one of the things Cooper's book gets dragged into three main discussions. The Pershing myth, the ratios, the 5-to-1 myth, if you will, and also the sort of the survivability myth. He talks about these aspects. And people kind of drag him into his book into it because it gets quoted a lot, and because Nicholas Moran gets quoted a lot, because that video shows up in a lot of forums and blogs. And here's another part in the same blog where he's talking about, according to some, they mean M26 by D-Day. General Patton had no real influence on tank development and deployment. Okay, and we're going to talk about the difference in words. What is, deployments, priorities, there's a difference. We'll come back to this momentarily. Then you get into what I'm going to call the troll layer of the onion. All right, these are the guys who glom on, and, something about the internet makes people feel that they can, they lose their decorum, for lack of a better term, and I quite frankly think he lied. He was never a combat officer. He greatly embellished, blah, blah, blah. So we'll come back to these kinds of commentary momentarily. So what I try to do is take, the good, the bad, the ugly, the reputable ones, the ones who aren't necessarily using logic and statistics particularly well. And then we're going to talk about the guys down here at the bottom. Go ahead and put my little laser pointer around here. We'll talk about these guys here at the bottom. I'm just using this one as an example, but there's plenty of them out there like this. So if we start here, let's focus on these guys. I quite frankly think he lied. I don't think that an officer would have been doing manual work cleaning the meat off the inside of tanks. He was never a combat officer. He's attempting to cover up his inadequacies, blah, blah, blah. When you get into personal attacks like this, to be honest, I think he's, next, right? The guy who's talking like this attacks him, calls him a liar, and provides zero evidence of it. Doesn't even really provide good evidence in the book about how he contradicts himself or how he's simply wrong. You can be wrong and not be intentionally lying. You might be misinformed, right? He doesn't do a very good job. And when you see this kind of stuff, I'll be honest, it doesn't do much for me. Fortunately, there are some folks, I don't know if Richard Anderson is from The Matrix or not, but there are some folks that counter this particular individual as a little illustration. I think you're being quite unfair to Cooper, blah, blah, blah. But unfortunately, that outer layer becomes of the onion becomes quite, personal and mean-spirited and not really productive. So we're not going to focus anymore on them. So let's focus on the one thing that really is sort of the main crux of the attacks on death traps, and that's the Pershing thing. The whole M26 Patton killed the Pershing kind of thing. And I've already mentioned some of the stuff that Nick talks about. There's another guy here that's talking about M26s on D-Day, that we looked at that, and that he has no real influence. And okay. So let's see. I took all those things and I sort of boiled them down into, sort of generic accusations. Like, okay, in addition to the ones I already mentioned, there's the folks that talk about, well, his is a first person testimonial, like Stephen Ambrose. Stephen Ambrose wrote the foreword to his book, and there's a lot of people out there. Oh, Stephen Ambrose is, his version of history is not authoritative, blah blah blah, and so they sort of slime him with the same paintbrush. Cooper relies on anecdotal and secondhand stories, and okay, of which he has no personal knowledge. I'll use one of the examples. He tells the story about the Malmedy Massacre in the opening part of his chapter on the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, he wasn't there, but that doesn't mean that he lied or that he made it up or even that he's propagating myths, because there are myths about the Malmedy Massacre. He's conveying a story, an anecdotal story, because if you look at what the book is, it is a narrative of the European theater of operations, generally focused on the 3rd Armored Division, and of course injected with his personal experiences. So he wasn't everywhere on the battlefield, and in order to tell the story, he is going to be relying on anecdotal, secondhand story kind of stuff. So I think that's a valid criticism, but that doesn't mean he lied. It doesn't mean he made it up, and it doesn't mean he's propagating myths. Okay. Say what you will about Ambrose, and there's plenty to be said. Ambrose brought World War II in Citizen Soldier and D-Day and the Clear Blue Sky or whatever. He brought more Americans in touch with their history than most of those, quote, scholarly guys. And by definition, when you're cutting and pasting, testimonials together, it's not going to be quite as scholarly as, say, Cornelius Ryan or Anthony Beaver. That doesn't mean it's not an appropriate book. So I'll leave to you to decide on this. But these stories that he's telling, one of the things that's important is you can tell the difference when he's talking about his own personal experiences and those that he's reciting, because he uses different pronouns. He uses me, myself, I, my driver, that sort of thing when he's talking about his personal things. And he talks about us, they, them, when he's talking about the larger narrative. So it's not very hard for the average human being to figure out when he's talking about himself and when he's not. As for the claims, well, Pershing he says that Patton did not like the Pershing. Okay, he never says that. He claims that the M26 Pershing could have been available for D-Day. So these are the two that sort of drag his book into the realm of controversy. Okay, so what did he actually? And we'll come back and talk about the other stuff about the relative performance, the 5-to-1 ratio thing, the survivability thing. We'll come back and talk about those in a moment. So let's look at the crux of the M26 Pershing Patton controversy. Okay, this section of the book, 24 through 29, he's talking about an event where key leaders meet at Tidworth Downs in London in January 1944. And, he talks about the fact that Patton was not enthusiastic, not because he didn't like the tank, but because he didn't think it cited that it didn't fit the doctrine of the Breakthrough Armored Division, at least in Patton's point of view. And the other aspect of that is he was looking at a film. At Tidworth Downs, all the other weapon systems were right there, live demonstrations of what they were doing. And the T-26, it wasn't even an M26 yet, was a film. Okay, this is January, 4 months away. So he's basically not a big fan of it, right? I'm going to skip down here and point out that at other points he talks about, for example, Patton's recommendation to concentrate on the M4 would have disastrous consequences, in his opinion. And he does point out here pretty clearly that he knows that Patton didn't make the decision, but he also thinks that Patton was influential in the decision. Okay, So we'll come back to this. Now, in the middle here is really where the crux of the matter comes for dragging death traps into the whole Pershing D-Day, Patton killed the Pershing quagmire. He has this paragraph, 3 sentences, where he talks about the T-26 being tested. It was approved by both Ordnance and the Armor Force boards. The Tank Automotive Center in Detroit, so these are the manufacturers, were prepared to execute with the go-ahead from SHAEF. And because of the urgency, the War Production Board was prepared to try and implement production schedules that would get it in time for the invasion of Normandy. Okay, so this is the heart and soul of the attack on Cooper's book. Okay, so let's go take a look at something real quick. He talks about the ordnance, the tank facilities in Detroit, and the ordnance recommending 500 be built here in September. Okay, this is what he's referencing, this block here. This comes out of the chieftain's presentation. So if you look at this little red block, imagine that the people involved in this are the tank division in Detroit, basically the manufacturers, the ordnance guys who are, for lack of a better term, the proponent of the tank, and the armored force, basically the tank force commander or board. And he's saying that they are recommending to build 500 of them. Now, the other group of people he's talking about are basically Eisenhower, SHAEF, and Patton over in Europe as the end users. So these are the providers and they're the end users. Now, there are some people in between here we're going to talk about in a minute that sort of muddy up the water when you're talking about it. What he said was 3 sentences. Okay, the Ordnance Board, the Armored Force Board, and the Tank Automotive Center were basically ready to go. At least that's the way he describes it. And that if the decision had been made, the War Production Board would have prioritized it and tried to make it available for the Normandy invasion. Okay, literally 1 sentence out of the book suggesting that the M26 Pershing could be made available for D-Day. Okay, so a couple things we know. Patton didn't kill the Pershing. It does make it into combat in the spring of 45. So whatever influence Patton had, he wasn't the decision maker. And from his own words, Cooper acknowledges that he was persuasive, not that he was the decision maker. Okay, so here are the kinds of attacks that are made on Cooper. Okay, let's start here. This is now, remember the Axis History Forum was where the trolls were. Well, they're not all trolls over there. There's a guy here, Rich, whatever, top T090, whatever, actually has a fairly meaningful discussion at this link right here. But he's making a criticism of Pershing, or of Cooper's knowledge of the procurement process. First, the M26 Pershing wasn't an M, and it certainly wasn't known initially as the Pershing, nor was it heavy. Okay, let's see. The first 10 were T26E1s, and then T26E1-1s, and then T15E1/L73s, and then T26E3s, and let's see here. They were all classified as medium tanks, but it wasn't until June they were reclassified as heavy tanks, but in between they were classified as medium heavy tanks. And it wasn't a Pershing, it was a Zebra. Okay. When you're writing a book for a general audience, not tank nerds, right? Not the people who want every little detail of the progression of the T26 tank through its progression. When you're writing a book about the European theater of operation, there are 2 main American tanks, the M4 Sherman and the M26 Pershing. The fact that in January of 1944 it was not yet classified as the M26 and named as the Pershing and classified as a heavy tank it ultimately becomes the M26 Pershing heavy tank. And you're not going to try and you're not going to confuse your readers. This book isn't about the Pershing tank and its development cycle and the approval cycles. So when you start down this kind of nitpicky critique, I'll be honest with you, to me it just discredits the rest of it. But let's go on to the part that actually has a little bit of merit. He says that the claim that it was tested and approved by Ordnance and Armed Forces Bureaus, he doesn't agree with that. Okay. He goes on to say, somewhat contradictory, he's saying the recommendations by the Ordnance Board for 500 was approved, but the Army Ground Forces non-concurred. Okay, this is important. Cooper never says anything about the Army Ground Forces. He refers to the Ordnance and Armored Forces Boards, and the Armored Force Board is different than the Ground Force Board. Okay, it's confusing. I'll show you a graphic here in just a moment. Okay, so when we start throwing around accusations, it's like, okay, maybe we ought to have our ducks in a row, accuse him of what he actually said and what he actually wrote. Okay, so let's take a look at this slide from the Chieftain real quick again and say, all right, January 44, initial production 250. So Nick's pretty well versed. He knows generally what he's talking about, right? This guy seems to know what he's talking about. Well, interesting. June, the Ordnance Team requests full authorization. Interestingly, the Armored Force concurs. Maybe they concurred back in September. Here those Army Ground Forces guys don't concur again. Troublemakers that they are. But when they finally do agree to something, it's 250. So you get the first request for 250 in June of 44, according to Rick, but you get it in January of 44, according to Nick. So, why are we being particularly critical of Cooper's assessment based on what his information was, that 3 of the agencies agreed in September? I don't know. Food for thought. Down here, he talks about none of these activities required Schafe's approval. In fact, they were out of the procurement loop, and then he immediately contradicts himself by saying it was their job to recommend, request, and issue requirements. Now, okay, in 3 sentences, when you're trying to talk about this, nobody's going to get into, if the end customer has feedback into the procurement process, then he's a part of the system. Even if he's not a formal member of the decision board process, it is totally ridiculous to suggest that the end user has no influence in what they get. And then he goes on and proves it. After, I think he said 9 years of miscellaneous research, he came across some of the Schafe communications. Now, they didn't go back to the January Tidworth Downs meeting, but they pick up here in March, and we're talking, this is the customer talking about, hey, Torquematic transmissions, is an unknown quantity for a vehicle of this size. 75 millimeter guns. 71 T-26s in theater, and then maybe more, 250 on the way. And by the way, we want a ratio of 2 90 millimeters to 1. He's proving exactly what Cooper is implying. Cooper is saying that Patton and Schafe provided feedback on the priorities of what needed to be focused on, and that the system was responsive. And these are indicators that that kind of communication was going on all the time. We know for a fact that the invasion was pushed back in part from May to June because of the desire to get some additional Higgins boats deployed and to get some LSTs from the Mediterranean. The end customer does have a say in how all this works. They may not be a formal member of in the decision chain, but they are a part of the supply and demand chain, whatever you want to call it. So if I tried to lay this out in a way that kind of made sense to me. Cooper talks about the Tank Automotive Center, the Ordnance Bureau or branch. He didn't say bureau, but Ordnance Bureau or branch, and the Armored Forces, basically the Tank Forces Board. He also talks about Schaeff and Patton as the consumers. Well, in between them is the Army Ground Forces Board. This is the board that Rich 1090 is referring to. I couldn't find anything on the War Production Board and its role and whether or not it was going to do anything for D-Day or not, blah, blah, blah. And of course, Marshall is in here somewhere. But the point is, these are the guys, producing and, proponents of the tank. Here are the consumers, just, providing feedback about whether they even wanted the tank. And here were the decision makers taking the inputs from the proponents and the consumers and making the best judgment they could. Okay, so I'm going to throw in one other little extension here just to give you some sort of sense of things. Remember, this is a personal memoir of a lieutenant way down here. Okay, and so if he didn't get it perfectly right, I'll let you decide how much weight to put on those three sentences that seem to be driving this. Okay, I will say this: if you think about Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf, when he got to the desert in Saudi Arabia wearing black leather boots, he realized that was not acceptable, and got some off-the-shelf tan desert boots, wore a few different pairs, picked one out, and within months, the entire army, American army in the desert, was wearing tan desert mesh boots. The customer does indeed get what it wants a lot of the time. Now I want to go back real quick to this slide right here. And kind of point out, talk about the D-Day thing. The one sentence that he talks about is that here, when the ordnance folks, remember he's an ordnance officer, and if the information he's going to have is related to probably coming from that source, he's sitting right here saying that the ordnance guys and Rich and Nick both agree with this, that the ordnance guys submitted a 500 tank request that was denied by the Army Ground Forces Board. Okay, which is right here, if you will, somewhere, the group of people that's right in this little void. Okay, think about what's going on in 1943, September of 1943. If this tank was ready for prime time, or close to being ready for prime time, there's still 7-8 months to go before the May invasion date, and 8 months to go before the June invasion date that turned out to be. The entire American industrial complex in the fall of 43 was trying to get ready for D-Day. So to suggest that it was a possibility that if America put its priorities on the Pershing tank, that it could have been made available for D-Day, that is not a ridiculous claim. Okay, plain and simple. When the United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor, we were completely flat-footed. In the fall, the next year, about 8 months later, we deployed an entire army to North Africa. If we had wanted those Pershings to be on the beaches at D-Day, we could have done it. So the people that are saying, the whole D-Day thing is crazy, okay? Well, maybe it was crazy. Maybe he shouldn't have wrote that one sentence. But the only time he actually talks about the consequences of that decision really comes here, pages 169, and then again in the appendices. He talks about this in the late 44, in the November timeframe when we're operating against Aachen, and he's making the suggestion or the assessment that imagine if we had the Pershing is the what if tank. What if we had Pershings for D-Day? What if we had Pershings in the Battle of the Bulge, right? He's saying that what if we had these tanks for the Aachen campaign, and we drove deep enough into Germany that it threatened the flank of the Ardennes? The Battle of the Bulge may never have occurred, right? That's a completely valid speculation. In his own words, This, of course, is pure speculation. So how do you attack a guy who speculates about it and then tells you, I understand that this is speculation, but what if? So I just don't think that it's a valid, the whole Pershing patent thing that comes from those three sentences just doesn't jive in my book. Now, some of the things I think that Cooper probably should be called to task for, if you will. He talks about the massive effort, the 50, 2.5 ton trucks needed to carry parts, plus all the maintenance company parts, and even if we doubled the number of spare parts trucks, it wouldn't have been enough to handle the M4 casualties. We didn't have the people to do the paperwork, even if we did, and so we had to convert over to cannibalization, and it worked to the advantage of the entire division. Okay, now put yourself back in Tidsworth Down in January, less than 4 months away from the invasion. Patton's looking at a video, 8mm film of a tank, and he's got on one side, he's got an M4 live physical tank right there that he's just fought in Africa and Sicily with. Okay, is it reasonable that Patton and Eisenhower would want to deploy the M26 on D-Day, the most important battle of the war? What if it had been a dud? Can anyone say Kursk? Can anyone say Tiger tanks and Panther tanks being deployed before they were ready for prime time? So he's critical of the decision, which he thinks Patton influenced, not the decision that he thinks Patton made. He's critical of that decision and says it has catastrophic consequences, but then he points out that, heck, the supply chain couldn't even handle the M4. Imagine if we had to have a whole nother set of maintenance trucks to support M26s. So I think he kind of dismisses the requirements, and he's not 100% consistent throughout the book about everything. He says that Washington listened to Schaeff when they deprioritized the Pershing. He says that when the supply system couldn't keep up and they started cannibalizing, that the system responded to the need to cannibalize. And then he goes in and says, despite military bureaucracy, Americans and British, they came up with great ideas. And here's the thing that is not consistent. Even more surprising, the authorities listened. If you read his book, this is a little bit of a contradiction. Why would he be surprised that they would listen? They listened to everything else he suggested, right? And if anything, this kind of indirectly reinforces his whole patent thing. He's saying at every turn of his book, when he talks about how reality comes up against theory, that when reality won out, that the system, that the military bureaucracy was indeed generally responsive to that reality, and he thinks that it was a good thing. So, okay, it does sort of reinforce the view that Patton and Eisenhower could have influenced the decision. I have no idea whether they did or not. I don't really care. It's a very complex decision, and no one person was responsible for it. I suppose McNair was technically like the guy who signed the documents, but it's kind of a mountain out of a molehill. Okay, so now let's move on. So his book is dragged into this controversy about Pershings and D-Day and Pershings and Patton, and it's on the basis of 3 sentences out of 333 pages. Okay, you do the math. You decide for yourself. If you want, just rip out that page and then read the rest of the book, and I think you'll be very happy with the book. Okay, as for the rest of the stuff, we're not going to go into a lot of detail on this. I'm going to talk about the relative qualities. I have another video that goes in much more detail, but I wanted to kind of just give you a highlight of some of the things that his book gets dragged into. And here's the one, the one thing that I think is just kind of like a red herring. One of my favorite quotes from Death Traps is, to make things worse, the committee was dominated by Yankees. They named the tanks Grant and they named the M4 Shermans, and Southerners were aggravated, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And then, this guy goes on, oh, this is disgustingly stupid, and I can't help feeling slightly angry at him. And by the way, I'm a Georgian. I'm like, well, I'm a Yankee. I was born in Chicago, raised in Illinois, went to Kentucky from middle school, high school, ended up at Texas A&M in the Corps of Cadets, where I met a guy named Hardy. I jokingly asked him, "Hey, are you related to General Hardy from the Civil War?" "Yes, I am, on my dad's side." I mean, like, really? I mean, come on. I've lived in the South for almost 40 years. Had lots of conversations with American Southerners about Civil War topics. The fact that he would say this, remember, Washington and Aberdeen Proving Grounds are in Yankee territory. The fact that he says this, I think it's kind of funny. Does it help his credibility? No, not really. He could have not put this sentence in. This guy tries to say, well, the British named them. Like, okay, the British might have named them originally, but ultimately the Americans did indeed adopt those names. So it would have been Aberdeen or Washington or somewhere up one of those boards that embraced the names. And having lived in the South, I don't find this anything but entertaining. Okay. What I do find irritating is when people don't use logic consistently. During Panther versus M4 engagements, the Panther had a 1.1 to 1 advantage while on the defensive. However, the M4 had an 8.4 to 1 advantage while on the offensive. Now, as I understand it, if an M4 is on the offense against a Panther, by definition, the Panther is on defense. So if the M4 has an 8.4 to 1 advantage when it's on offense, then by definition, the Panther has a 1.1 to 1 advantage on the defense. I don't see how both tanks can have the advantage. Now, there may be some alternate universe logic that you could think of, but I'm not, the only 8.4 that I've ever seen had to do with production ratios, and I've never seen anything for the battlefield. The number that is frequently quoted is this one over here, this 3.6, which comes out of a 1946 U.S. Army Ballistic Research Laboratory survey. If anyone knows where the link to that is, send it to me because I haven't been able to read it. But bottom line, this whole sentence is diametrically opposed to itself. You can't have two tanks with the advantage at the same time. Okay. Everything that he writes is basically done in a memoir, first person or, recanting a story. When he's talking about those first person, there's nothing about his book that is out of the ordinary for a narrative, a memoir. Okay. I'm not going to go into all these things right here. I point this out. It's a video you can called Scorched Earth. You can go out on YouTube, look it up. 44 minutes in, you can see these. These are first-person testimonials of people who are operating against tigers and panthers, and they were saying and they were talking about the relative effectiveness of the tanks, and nothing that Cooper says in his book is inconsistent with the overwhelming majority of first-person testimonials from the combat guys. Remember, he's a maintenance guy, but the combat guys are saying, yeah, our tanks, our guns weren't as good, our armor wasn't as good. The only thing that we could rely on was either numbers or tactics. Okay, now we're not going to get into the survey, but not only is there first-person testimonials to work with, but there's actual well-done surveys. In the case of this particular survey by the British, they go back and they look at a series of engagements, and they break them out. They break them out by Shermans versus Tigers, Panthers in a mix against all tanks. Bottom line is, it's a pretty thorough study. They have a good number of cases to look at. They come away with a couple of observations that generally the British had a 2-to-1 or 4-to-1 advance, between 2-to-1 and 4-to-1. So they generally satisfied the numeric threshold to achieve this ratio. And the key here is the ratio for of the Allies to the enemy for Allied success. They had to have, in their own words, more than 2 Allied tanks were required for success against each enemy tank. Okay, So here we now have first-hand testimonial, and we have a detailed survey of actual engagements. I think they had 250. They used about 112 of them that they found were sufficiently detailed and accurate. Okay, so his book gets dragged into this 5-to-1 myth kind of thing, and it's not really a major contention that he's making. But what he does talk about is sort of the physics of it, the characteristics of the tank. And he cites the the velocity of the rounds, and he talks about the penetration power as being, the square of the muzzle velocity. So a little bit of increase in speed goes a long way. I think he has two different numbers for the Sherman. I think I saw in his book 2000, but both of the Sherman and the Firefly are inferior to the main tanks that they were encountering over in Europe, 3000, 33, and 3100 on their muzzle velocities. Okay, he does talk about the Pershing, and that even though it was not the muzzle velocity wasn't as good, that the caliber of the shell and the muzzle velocity was adequate. It was completely adequate and made it the most competitive tank on the battlefield from the American side. So, okay, physics. The guns were inferior, period. So let's take a look at armor. In his video, the myth video, Chieftain cites the fact that the Sherman's 2 inches of armor was actually more effective because it's 45 degrees. And that's true. Sloped armor is more effective. Comes out to be about 3.6 of effective armor. Okay. Tiger tank had 4 to 4.3s of actual armor. Now, with due respect to all the, test people, I would prefer 4.43 or 4.3 inches of real armor to 3.6 pretend armor any day. You want to take the Sherman? Go for it. I'll take the Tiger. You make the call. Where Death Traps comes in is he also talks, Cooper also brings up the Panther. And he talks about, this is a tank that had 3.5 inches of armor up front, almost as much actual armor as pretend armor. And then he mentions 38 degrees. This was according to the Army ordnance training that he received, 38 degrees was the angle at which ricochets, basically it's critical angle for ricochets. So the Germans obviously did some testing, came to the same conclusion. So they put their 3.5 inches with a 38 degree slope, and they got both thickness and ricochet protection, sloped armor protection. And if you do a rough ratio just to get a general idea, I couldn't find the exact effectiveness. I couldn't find a chart with it, but it's like 5 inches of armor. This 3.5 inches of armor is more effective than the Tiger in many respects. So physics, your armor is better. The German armor is better, and the German gun is better. Okay, and how does that relate to casualties? Okay, going back momentarily to the Chieftain. He cites this chart right here. He talks about how, 18% for infantry and 3%, so it's much better to be an armor guy. Well, I agree. I don't want to be an infantry guy. But he also goes on to talk about how there's a difference between 18% for all infantry and, say, a unit that was in the line. And a unit that was in the line, 4th ID, had 700% casualty rate. They replaced their losses 7 times. Okay, but then this is where I kind of lose track with Nick. He sort of accepts this number, this 3% number. Well, if you go to Cooper's book, this is one of the places it's useful. 232 tanks, Shermans at D-Day, 648 Shermans completely destroyed, another 700 knocked out, 580 loss rate. Now, whether his numbers are perfectly accurate or not is irrelevant. That's a pretty specific number. This one's a generic 700 number. That's a pretty specific number. I don't know where he got it, but 580% starting to look like pretty close to this. That's 600% compared to 700% in the frontline troops. And he talks about the fact that when we start looking at this number, Nicholas points out that this was armored enlisted, people who were trained in the armor, disciplines and sent MOSs and sent across. And Cooper talks about the fact that they took guys right off the boat, basically infantrymen, and trained them real time. Okay, and that is a doable thing, believe it or not. You can train 3 of the 5 positions in about a day's worth of training. Okay, these are all my numbers, and it comes from my other video. I just put it in here for your entertainment, but I also wanted to show this to sort of point out how death traps is useful. He also provides some photographic evidence. These were 2 76mm armor-piercing rounds that hit the front of a Pershing, 38-degree Pershing slope, barely dented it. It was the third shot that killed this tank. Okay, so again, you do the math. If you want the Sherman, I'll take the Panther and the Tiger, because the main thing that the Sherman had was supposedly speed and reliability. Well, if my tank breaks down en route to fighting you, I'm going to get up and run away. Okay, but once we get into the fight, I want the Panther or I want the Tiger. Okay, so we've kind of covered these. I've scratched them out for a reason. I just don't think that they're entirely legitimate attacks. He never said that Patton did not like the Pershing. He said that Patton didn't think it was suited to the armored division's doctrine. Okay, that's different. His one sentence about D-Day was not beyond reason. If the Ordnance Bureau's decision had been made and America had put their mind to it in September of 43, it is completely reasonable to think that a significant number of them would have been available as early as D-Day. Now, whether that would have been smart, I completely agree with the Patton-Eisenhower point of view. I don't want to risk D-Day on an unproven tank. But who's to say that they couldn't have started deploying those M26s a little bit right after D-Day and before the fall campaigns into the Siegfried Line, into the Aachen, and then into the Battle of the Bulge and beyond? Who's to say? It's all speculation, right? It's the what-if tank. So I don't think that it's really fair to degrade the book or berate the book or whatever, downgrade the book because of what really amounts to 3 sentences. And then with respect to the other things, he provides useful information about the relative quality of the various tanks. So first and foremost, if we're looking at this thing, this is a narrative comparable to almost every other first-person narrative I've ever read, every memoir. It's a good read. Anyone who can make maintenance even remotely interesting deserves credit. Those guys work their butts off. I got to have one of the cool jobs, okay? The dashing pilot, right? I got the cool job. And every day when I would go get an aircraft to go fly, the amount of work that went into making that helicopter ready for flight is staggering. To keeping it refueled and rearmed, it's a staggering amount of work. And he does a great job of presenting a different perspective that you will almost never see. Okay, at least in all the books I've read, I've never seen a guy talk about maintenance and make it, make it worth reading. Okay, he's on multiple battlefields. He's there for the bulk of the campaign. He gives some details, dates, places, times, and he has some photographic evidence. He got some of those photos from some of his friends. They're not all his personal photos. I get it. Bottom line is, I think it's worth your time. I think it's worth your money. It's worth your money. It's like $8-9 plus shipping and handle. But more importantly, I think it's worth your time to read it. And, I don't think we should be making our disagreements, especially when we're not entirely quoting him exactly accurately, and we're nitpicking when the M26 got designated an M26. That kind of stuff, I don't see that personally. And when you start to disagree out of 330 pages, this is the bulk right here in the background here. This is the bulk of the stuff that drives the controversy around this guy. It's just, he's not the source of these myths. I mean, he might have been echoing some sentiments, but he is not the source of this myth. Okay, I hope you liked the video. If you did, like and subscribe, blah, blah, blah. I'd love to have your comments, especially if you got anything relative to that 1946 ballistic lab report. I can't seem to find it anywhere. Or if you got the Schaeff communications, one way or the other, about the M26 from the Tidworth Downs. If you got any information about that stuff, please chuck it in the comments and let's dig into it. Let's see what it really says. So, hope you enjoyed it. Have a good evening, and thanks for watching my video.